Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When my parents told me they wouldn't waste a cent on a useless degree, they didn't say it with cruelty or anger. They said it like it was obvious, like they were doing me a favor, like they had already made the decision for me and now expected me to nod along, thank them, and find a real job at a diner or a dental office, or maybe marry someone who could take over the bills they were tired of paying. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't beg them to reconsider. I just stood there in the kitchen, still wearing my name tag from the bookstore job I took after school, while Zach walked in through the garage door, smelling like gasoline and Axe body spray, laughing at something his friend had said on speakerphone, and grabbed a soda from the fridge like he owned the place, like he hadn't failed half his classes and just gotten a second speeding ticket. My parents beamed at him like he'd come back from war. They didn't even glance at me. Zach had dreams of starting a contracting business, though dreams might be too generous a word. It was more like a passing thought he'd mentioned once while high in the basement, and now it had become gospel truth that he was destined for blue-collar greatness. So when he walked out into the driveway 2 days after graduation and saw the brand-new black pickup truck with oversized tires and a red ribbon still pinned to the hood, he screamed like a kid on Christmas morning. My mom cried. My dad slapped him on the back like he'd just been named heir to the family fortune. And me? I stood in the upstairs hallway just out of view, clutching the acceptance letter I hadn't shown anyone yet. I had gotten into 4 universities. Not 1, not 2, 4. One of them had offered me a full ride after I scored in the top 2% nationally in science and math. I'd spent nights studying formulas while Zach snuck out through the basement window to go street racing or party with the same group of people whose only dream was getting out of community college without a DUI. I had worked weekends at the bookstore, tutored 2 kids in algebra, and cleaned houses with my best friend's mom during breaks, just to save enough to buy a refurbished laptop. My parents never asked where I went on Saturdays. They just assumed I was reading again, as if that was some kind of flaw I needed to outgrow. When the truck arrived, I still hadn't told them. I waited, I watched, I measured the weight of their silence every time Zach talked about building something from scratch, or being his own boss, or not needing a stupid degree to make real money. They cheered him on like he was already rich. I sat through dinners where they debated what decals he should put on the truck windows, what tool sets he should invest in, what clients he could start with. My mother called it his launch pad. My father said it was seed money. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. The night before I left, I cleaned my room top to bottom. I packed only what I could carry. I left the acceptance letter folded in the drawer beside my bed. I thought maybe they'd find it. Maybe they'd call and say they were proud. Maybe they'd ask why I hadn't said anything. But I didn't expect it. I left before sunrise, walked 2 miles to the bus station, and bought a one-way ticket with a student discount code I found online. I didn't cry. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't write a note. What was there to say? Thanks for the roof? Good luck with Zach's empire? I didn't owe them closure. As the bus pulled away and I watched the landscape change from the neighborhood I grew up in to the long gray stretches of highway that led to somewhere else, anywhere else, I remember staring at my reflection in the window. I looked tired but not broken. I looked quiet but not small. That morning, I'd worn my oldest jeans, a thrift store hoodie, and my hair tied back in a loose knot. But for the first time in years, I felt powerful. Not because I was running away, but because I was doing it without asking permission. The silence I carried wasn't empty. It was loaded, heavy, focused. While Zach posted his new truck on Instagram with hashtags like #hustle and #blessed, I was sitting in a cramped bus seat with a duffel bag at my feet and an email on my phone confirming my enrollment, my scholarship, and my housing assignment. No fanfare, no bow, no champagne, just direction. I didn't hate them, not yet. Hate takes energy, and I needed all of mine to build the future they didn't believe I deserved. But I made a promise to myself somewhere between Ohio and New York. I wouldn't prove them wrong out loud. I'd do it in silence, so that one day, when they finally looked up and realized what they'd lost. I'd already be out of reach, not to punish them, but to make sure they knew they were never invited to the celebration. And that celebration, it started the moment I stepped off the bus with nothing but belief in myself and a plan I didn't need anyone else to validate. The first few weeks in the city were loud in a way that didn't come from noise, but from contrast. The kind of internal static that rattles your chest when you go from being ignored in your own home to being completely invisible in a place where no one knows your name and no one has any expectations of you, good or bad, because no one even notices you exist. The university campus sprawled like its own small country, with polished walkways and signs in 3 languages, where students walked like they already belonged to something greater, like they'd been raised with the certainty that someone would always answer their call if things went wrong. I walked among them like a ghost with a schedule and a loaner laptop, one of those kids who answered questions correctly, but didn't stay after class to make friends or ask about internships or talk about summer plans. I sat in the back. I listened. I didn't offer more than I had to. I saved my breath and kept my world small because I'd learned long ago that speaking into a void doesn't make the echo feel like company. My dorm room was basic. Twin bed, plastic dresser, shared bathroom, and a cracked window that let in wind, but not sound. My roommate, Kayla, was pre-law, the kind of girl who got calls from her mom 3 times a day and left scented candles burning even though they were technically banned. She tried to draw me out with smiles and invitations to movie nights or karaoke, but eventually she stopped asking and started calling me the mystery girl, which she thought was funny, but I knew was just her way of coping with my silence. I didn't blame her. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I just didn't have room in my head for bonding when every part of me was focused on staying afloat, on keeping my scholarship, on making my money stretch, on eating once a day if needed so that I wouldn't have to call home and hear my father say, "Told you so," while my mother quietly sighed in the background like she was disappointed I hadn't figured out how to survive without needing anyone. I got a job in the campus tutoring center by pretending I liked people more than I did. I taught struggling freshmen how to write a thesis, how to factor polynomials, how to believe they weren't as dumb as their parents said. I did it with patience and politeness, but I never let anyone get close enough to ask about me. When students thanked me or tried to follow me on social media, I smiled and said I didn't really use it. That wasn't a lie. I had deleted everything the day I left home. I didn't want updates, didn't want photos, didn't want tagged memories reminding me that while I was eating canned soup and spending nights in the library, because the heat in my building barely worked, Zach was probably blowing tire smoke through small-town streets with the same recklessness my parents once mistook for drive. Sometimes, late at night when my willpower slipped and curiosity got the better of me, I'd type his name into the search bar and scroll through whatever public posts still floated around. He had dropped out of community college within 6 months and had started working part-time at a garage owned by one of my dad's poker buddies. There were pictures of him shirtless, grinning with grease on his jeans, leaning against the truck like it was a monument. In one video, he revved the engine and yelled something like, "Self-made, baby," and my stomach twisted. Not with jealousy, not with sadness, but with something deeper, something more like recognition. Because in that moment, I realized he really believed it. He believed that truck had launched him into adulthood, that every choice made for him had been his own idea. And maybe that was the real gift my parents gave him, blindness wrapped in a bow. Meanwhile, I was building something no one saw. My GPA stayed perfect. I wrote papers until 3 a.m. and helped professors with research on climate modeling, even though it paid almost nothing. I took notes on my own notes. I recorded lectures and replayed them on the bus rides to the grocery store so I wouldn't miss a thing. I knew that if I slipped, even a little, the scholarship could vanish, and with it, the only proof I had that I was worth something on paper. There was no safety net, no backup plan, just the quiet promise I had made to myself in the hallway of that house the day Zach's truck arrived. Succeed so thoroughly they won't even recognize you when you come back. But I didn't go back. Not for Thanksgiving, not for Christmas, Not when my mother sent a short message after almost a year saying, "We hope you're okay." I didn't respond. I didn't block her either. I wanted her to feel the weight of waiting. I wanted her to refresh her inbox and wonder if the daughter she dismissed like an overdue bill had become someone whose silence meant more than words ever could. Then, in my final year, an email arrived with a subject line that made my breath catch. Nomination for valedictorian consideration. It was brief, formal, congratulatory. My name had been submitted by 3 professors. My GPA was the highest in the College of Environmental Sciences. They wanted a sample of a commencement speech by the end of the month. I stared at the email for a full 5 minutes before closing my laptop without replying. For a moment, I felt panic. Not because I was unprepared, but because the idea of standing on a stage and having to speak into a microphone with my name echoing through loudspeakers felt too surreal, too far from the version of me that used to eat dinner in silence while my family discussed what brand of tires Zach should get. I wasn't ready for the light. Not because I feared it, but because I wasn't sure who I'd be once it touched me. And yet, as the weeks passed, and the speech draft took shape in a folder no one else saw, I began to understand that this wasn't about recognition. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about resurrection. I wasn't the daughter they remembered. I was someone new now. Someone forged not through praise or privilege, but through the long, cold weight of being invisible and learning how to breathe anyway. I didn't tell anyone I was valedictorian. Not Kayla, not the tutors I worked with, not even my academic advisor. I wanted the moment to remain untouched, free from interference or expectation. But I did do one thing, something reckless, something I instantly regretted but didn't take back. I forwarded the commencement invitation to my parents' shared email address. No message, no explanation, just the link. I didn't check if it was opened. I didn't wait for a response, because by then, I didn't need them to come. I just needed to know they'd finally been given the chance. The invitation lingered in my sent folder like a time bomb. I wasn't sure I wanted to see explode, sitting there in that sterile, silent inbox under the exact subject line they wouldn't recognize. No grand announcement, no caps locked, "Look at me now," just a polite institutional notification that their daughter was about to speak at a university they had probably forgotten the name of, in a city they hadn't thought to visit, for an achievement they never believed I could earn. There was something poetic, almost surgical, in the precision of it. Just a hyperlink, just a date, just a name, no pleading, no guilt. I didn't check for a read receipt, didn't scroll through the delivery details, didn't refresh to see if anyone had typed a reply, and then stopped halfway. The silence that followed wasn't disappointing. It was expected, like the last page of a book you've already read 100 times, where the characters never change, and the ending always arrives too early. I didn't tell anyone about the email, and I didn't mention the speech to anyone either. Not even when the coordinator followed up asking if I needed support crafting my message, suggesting perhaps I might want to share a personal story, something touching or relatable to the broader audience, which I assumed meant give them something digestible, something warm, maybe about overcoming odds or learning to believe in yourself, maybe a childhood memory that makes the crowd laugh before you make them cry. I wrote back politely, told them I was still outlining, which was technically true, but what I didn't say was that every time I opened a blank document and stared at the blinking cursor, I felt this strange, dense pressure in my chest. Not from stage fright, not from anxiety, but from the impossible challenge of compressing 4 years of silence, sacrifice, and sheer emotional grit into a few pages that wouldn't turn me into a cautionary tale or a walking headline. The truth was, I didn't want pity. I didn't want applause, at least not the kind people give because they feel guilty. I wanted clarity. I wanted for once to say something that didn't sound like a question, didn't sound like a request for someone to validate what I already knew, that I had done this on my own, and no one had handed me a damn thing, not a roadmap, not a boost, not a shortcut. I had walked through it alone, with my fists clenched in my coat pockets and my headphones up so loud I couldn't hear the self-doubt echoing off the walls of my dorm room every night. As I drafted the speech, rewriting the same paragraph over and over, I found myself revisiting memories I had buried so deep I thought they'd rotted away. Like the time I brought home a science fair trophy in 8th grade, and my mom barely looked up from her phone, muttering something about Zach's baseball tryouts. Or the time I mentioned applying to an out-of-state college and my dad said, "That's cute, but we don't do fantasy planning around here." These weren't dramatic moments, they weren't abuse, they weren't explosions, they were erosion, slow, steady, corrosive, the kind of damage that doesn't leave bruises but reshapes who you think you're allowed to become. And then, as if summoned by some cruel algorithm of timing, I got a text from Kayla while I was editing my final draft in the library. It was a screenshot, a local arrest log, Zach's name right there in grayscale. Zachary Miller, age 21, reckless driving, suspended license, resisting citation. Underneath, a blurry mugshot, eyes glassy, face smug in a way that didn't surprise me at all. Kayla didn't know it was my brother. She'd sent it because the guy looked like someone who used to hit on her at the gym. I stared at the screen for a while, then quietly closed the browser and set my phone face down on the table. I didn't tell her. I didn't respond. I didn't cry. I just kept typing. That night, for the first time in years, I found myself on my knees next to my bed. Not praying, not asking for signs or guidance, just grounding myself physically to the floor, so I wouldn't float off into the spiral of what-ifs that had started circling in my head like vultures. What if they showed up? What if they didn't? What if I saw them in the crowd? What if they left halfway through? What if Zach was in the back, mocking me under his breath, or worse? What if he sat there quietly and it finally dawned on him what he had become? These weren't just thoughts, they were weights. And I had learned long ago how to carry weights without flinching. I turned in my speech 2 days later. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was mine. It didn't name names, it didn't assign blame, but it cut, in the way only truth can. It talked about being underestimated, about silence being a strategy, not a weakness, about the difference between being alone and being abandoned, and how knowing that difference can become a kind of strength you never asked for, but end up using like armor. It wasn't bitter, but it wasn't sweet either. It was what it needed to be, honest and a little dangerous. The email I sent to my parents never got a reply, and for a while, I pretended that was their choice, that they'd read it and ignored it, that they were consistent to the bitter end, but something inside me began to gnaw at that version of the story. Maybe they never saw it. Maybe it went to spam. Maybe they changed their email and forgot to update me because I hadn't been someone they thought to inform. Or maybe, just maybe, they saw it, hesitated, and never figured out how to respond without making things worse. But I didn't follow up. I didn't send a reminder. I didn't call or text or write. I just watched the countdown to graduation tick lower each day, watched the sun set over the campus I had once entered like a ghost, and I made peace with the idea that whatever was about to happen would happen on my terms, even if they weren't there to see it. Because for once, the story wasn't theirs, it was mine. And I wasn't going to write them back into it just so they could feel better about the chapter they refused to read. The auditorium smelled like new paint and dust-covered velvet, the kind of manufactured prestige universities try to bottle and sell during alumni weekends. And as I stood in the narrow hallway lined with graduates adjusting their robes and caps, I could feel my heart beating in a way that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with the unshakable knowledge that today would not be remembered for the honor of the speech or the weight of the diploma, but for whatever was waiting just beyond the double doors that led to the crowd. The backstage area was cold, a strange contrast to the thick air inside the main hall, where parents clutched programs like golden tickets and siblings posed for awkward photos, and I could hear the low murmur of excitement, the names being read off, the crescendo of clapping, the polite pauses followed by the roar that signaled another future being launched into the air. I had rehearsed the speech in my head so many times that I could hear the cadence, even when I wasn't thinking. every syllable like a stone I had turned over 1,000 times, polishing the edges until they gleamed, not with sweetness or sentiment, but with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to prove, but still wanted the world to see how she had done it anyway. My hands weren't shaking, my breathing was steady, and yet there was a tension in my jaw I couldn't release, a strange pressure at the base of my neck that only tightened when I felt the subtle buzz of my phone in the pocket of my robe, just once, like a final test of whether I'd look. I did. It was a message from Kayla, no words, just a photo, blurry, zoomed in from the side entrance of the auditorium lobby. My mother, standing there, heels in one hand, clutching the graduation program like it was written in a language she'd never seen before, face flushed with either heat or panic, I couldn't tell, and her hair slightly damp, as if she'd run in the rain or maybe just sweated through whatever makeup she'd attempted that morning. The text that followed came through in fragments, like Kayla had typed it while ducking behind a pillar. She's asking if she's too late. She doesn't have a ticket. No one at the desk has her name. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because the only thought in my head at that moment was not anger, not sadness, but something far colder, sharper, and less poetic. It was this quiet realization that the woman who used to decide who ate dinner first and who got what for Christmas now couldn't even get past the lobby of a building I had entered through the front. And I didn't go out there. I didn't wave someone over to help her. I didn't pull strings or call favors or try to bridge the gap she had never once tried to cross when the distance was emotional rather than physical. Instead, I tucked the phone back into my gown, adjusted my cap one last time, and walked when they called my name. Not too fast, not too proud, just steady, deliberate, the way someone walks when they know they've arrived, not because someone cleared a path, but because they dug the road themselves with their own 2 hands. The lights were warm and unforgiving. The microphone wobbled slightly as I adjusted it. And the crowd, so many faces, so many claps, so many eyes expecting something clean and triumphant, fell into a hush as I unfolded my paper, breathed once, and began. My voice didn't shake. My story didn't stutter. I didn't name names. I didn't accuse. But I told the truth, cloaked in metaphor and calmness, wrapped in language that danced just far enough from confession to sound like inspiration. I talked about being underestimated, about how some roots grow stronger when buried under stone, about the silence that teaches you how to listen to yourself when no one else will. I said that sometimes the people who love you the least are the ones who make you who you are, not because of their affection, but because of their absence, and how there's a strange kind of power in learning to stop asking for what you know you'll never get. The applause didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like exhale, like the closing of a door I'd been holding open for far too long, waiting for someone to walk through who never did. I left the stage quietly, not stopping for photos or congratulations, and I didn't scan the crowd for familiar faces because I knew if my mother had made it inside, she wouldn't be sitting in the front row. She'd be off to the side, half hiding behind someone else's family, still trying to figure out what chapter of the story she had missed, and why no one had handed her the summary. Backstage, the graduates were crying and hugging and laughing like they were boarding a rocket to some better life, but I moved through them like water, polite, detached, not angry, just done. And when I finally walked out into the hallway and spotted the familiar silhouette near the vending machines, slumped on a bench with her purse at her feet, and her head bent forward like someone trying to pray without believing, I paused, not because I was unsure what to say, but because part of me wanted to see if she'd notice me first. She didn't. She looked up only when the automatic doors behind me opened, letting in a gust of warm summer air and the sound of the world moving on. Her face, older than I remembered, softer in some places, more worn in others, lit up in that desperate, brittle way people look when they realize they've missed something they thought would wait for them. And then she stood, slowly, like she wasn't sure her legs would carry her, and whispered the words I had known, were coming, but still wasn't ready to hear. "Rachel, is it too late to come in?" I didn't answer, not yet, because in that moment, I realized the real question wasn't whether she could get a seat in the auditorium. The real question was whether she still had a place in the story. The air outside the auditorium clung to my skin like something unfinished, something unspoken, a humid kind of weight that pressed against my shoulders as I stood there, just a few feet from the woman who had once decided my curfews, my clothes, my career, and in doing so, somehow believed she had also decided my future. My mother didn't look like the villain I had built in my head across 4 years of silence and separation. She looked small, not in height, but in presence, like the structure she had built her identity on had crumbled quietly behind her. And now all that remained was a middle-aged woman in wrinkled clothes, holding her purse like a life raft, staring at me as if I were a photograph she couldn't quite bring into focus. And yet, in her eyes, I could still see the familiar flicker of control, the reflexive instinct to patch things over, to find the script that would put her back into the center of a narrative she no longer owned. She opened her mouth to speak again, but I raised a hand, not harshly, not dramatically, but with the calm of someone who has rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the dark. In dorm rooms and laundry rooms and the back corners of crowded libraries, waiting for the right words to carry the final weight of years spent carrying too many others. I stepped closer, just enough so that we were standing face to face, and I looked at her the way I wish she had once looked at me, not with expectation or disappointment, but with curiosity, with the willingness to actually see me without the filter of her own fear and regret. "You didn't miss it," I said finally, my voice low but steady. "You just didn't know where to look." She blinked, confused, like she wanted to pretend she understood but didn't have the energy to keep the act going. And then, almost without realizing it, she reached out, her hand trembling just slightly, as if the years had caught up to her fingers first. I didn't step back, but I didn't lean in either. I let her hand hover between us, suspended in a space neither of us had the courage to bridge completely. Her face tightened, and she said, more to herself than to me, "We didn't know, Rachel. We thought you'd reach out. We thought you'd tell us what you needed." I exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in the kind of release that comes when you finally hear someone admit, without quite admitting, that they never really saw you as separate from their own script. "I didn't reach out," I said, "because you only ever listened when it was convenient. And I stopped mistaking convenience for care a long time ago." She looked like she wanted to cry, like the performance of guilt was rising in her throat, and for a split second I could almost see the old rhythm returning. The excuses, the half-baked apologies, the stories about how hard things had been with Zach, how they'd tried to be fair, how they thought I was so independent I didn't need help. But none of that mattered now. I didn't need her to confess, and I didn't need her to explain. I needed her to sit in that moment, seatless and out of breath, and feel what it was like to be the one on the outside looking in. She whispered, "Can we talk?" And I shook my head, not in anger, but with a finality so quiet, it felt like forgiveness. "Not now," I said, "and not because I hate you. I don't, I'm not here for that anymore." I turned before she could respond, not out of cruelty, but because I'd already said what needed to be said, and anything after that would have been repetition, which I had no interest in offering. The parking lot was bright with sunset, the light stretching long and golden across the pavement like a road that had waited 4 years for me to walk it with my head held high. The crowd had started to thin, families spilling into restaurants and cars, laughing, already telling stories about who said what and how proud they all were. While I slipped into the back seat of a rideshare with no fanfare, no bouquet, no audience. The driver glanced at my gown and said, "Big day?" And I just nodded, staring out the window at the building behind me where everything had just come full circle. I thought about the chair my mother never got to sit in, the one marked "reserved" in the front row, where I had hoped, maybe once, she might have seen me without squinting through disappointment. But now that it was over, I realized something more powerful than revenge, something deeper than even validation. I didn't need her to witness it to make it real. The moment was mine, not hers. And her absence hadn't diminished it. It had sharpened it, defined it, given it edges. I arrived back at my apartment as the light finally began to fade, the sky a mix of lavender and soft gray, and I stood for a long time in the doorway before going inside. The cap hung from my fingers, the tassel brushing against my wrist, and I thought about sending a photo to no one in particular, maybe posting it somewhere with a caption like, "Made it without you," but I didn't. I didn't need an audience. I didn't need applause. I had done what I came to do, and the story didn't need a witness to matter. Because the truth was, some chairs stay empty for a reason. Not because the people who should have filled them couldn't make it in time, but because they never earned the right to sit in them in the first place. And by the time they realize they want that seat, really want it, not out of obligation, but because they finally see what they missed, the ceremony is already over, the lights are already dimmed, and the person they came to watch has already walked off the stage, without ever needing to look back.